So we would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So welcome to our Nickel at Noon. As you probably know, we have our sessions every Thursday from 12 to 1. They're all free. Everybody's welcome. We're happy to see you all. If you're curious about our programming, everything is available on our website, nickel.ucalgary.ca. We also have accounts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. So feel free to subscribe to any of our mailing lists. Regarding today and all of the talks that we host, so please keep your microphones on mute, hold chat comments and questions until after the presentation, and please be aware that presentation will be recorded and added to the Nichols YouTube channel. Participants' names and chat will not be included in the recording, and if you speak, your voice will be included in the recording. I am your host for today, Marina Fisher, numismatic specialist at Nickel Galleries. And I also want to thank Marla Hallstad, front-end manager and co-host, who is helping with all of our Zoom events. Next week, April 15th, we have Museum and Heritage Studies students practicum presentation, so please join us for that as well. However, today we're extremely excited to welcome Amelia Dower, who will be talking about forming the Greek coin collection in the British Museum. So this talk will examine the ways in which Greek coins came into the British Museum collection during the 18th and 19th centuries and how the Department of Coins and Medals was established. Amelia Dower is the curator of Greek and Roman provincial coins at the British Museum. She curates a collection of nearly 100,000 coins from across the Mediterranean and neighboring regions, covering coins from the 7th century BC to the 3rd century AD. She co-leads the British Museum Histories of Collecting and Museums Research Group and has a particular interest in 18th and 19th century Greek coin collecting. So thank you, Amelia, so much. I am going to stop sharing and you are welcome to start your presentation.
Thank you so much, Marina. Let me just try to share my screen.
Perfect.
This always takes a moment. Right. Can you see my first slide is the is the question.
Yes, everything works great. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much. So good afternoon and good evening, everyone. You'll see me looking off to the side here. I have my text on a separate screen. Trying to arrange my desk in the best way possible. So my apologies for not looking directly at camera. But thank you so much for coming to Nickel at Noon. I'd like to start by thanking Marina and Nickel Galleries for inviting me to speak today. I'd also like to thank the British Museum Senior Archivist Francesca Hillier for all her help in my research. So today I'm going to talk to you about the formation of the Greek coin collection at the British Museum. I'm going to cover the first 100 years or so, from the founding of the museum in the 1750s to the foundation of the Department of Coins and Medals and the start of the British Museum Catalogue series in the 1860s and 1870s. I've chosen to talk to you about this period partly because it's the subject of my ongoing research, but also because this formation period gave the modern department and its collection its shape. Up to 1900, half the coins and in the Greek and Roman Provincial series today were acquired. So during this period I'm going to talk about. I believe it's important to understand some of the institutional history in order to work on research themes like, why does the British Museum have a series of differing registration numbers and what do they mean? How were coins acquired and where did they come from? And what are the challenges in tracing the history of coin collections? I'm focusing very much on the British Museum collection today, but there are various themes which would apply to research into other coin collections or numismatics generally. I'll point out in a few places where decisions curators have made over the years have caused confusion later on for researchers, so there are perhaps some lessons for modern curators here too. What I present today is ongoing research, and there is much still to be done to uncover the full history of the collection in the 18th and 19th centuries. I started much of this research in 2019, and my plan had been to work more fully on the subject in 2020. As we all know, however, none of our 2020 plans turned out quite as we had expected. Along with many of my colleagues, I was furloughed for part of the year, and access to research materials when I returned was limited. You will see as we go through where there is more research to be done on various topics. As the world opens up more, I'm hoping to continue research, so if there are particular aspects you are personally interested in, then please do get in touch with me after this talk. Today, I'll be focusing on quite high-level themes, the people involved, the systems in use, rather than talking about individual coins or mints. If you are interested in specific coins or mints, then please do take a look at the British Museum collection online through the website, and contact me if you need any further assistance with your research. On the screen here, you can see, I don't know why I'm pointing at the screen as if I were pointing at a large display. You can see an image of Montague House, which is the original home of the British Museum. This was a stately home acquired to house the first collections, and the present-day British Museum is built on the same site. Plans for the new building, designed by Robert Smirke, were being produced during the period I'm going to discuss, and building work commenced. Montague House was gradually demolished as the new British Museum building was constructed. So I have this image here as a reminder today that there are a lot of things going on in the 18th and 19th centuries at the British Museum that I don't have time to talk about in this presentation. If anyone is interested in the wider history of the museum, a really good general history can be found in David Wilson's book, The British Museum, A History, which was published in 2002. So today my talk falls into 4 sections. The 18th century, the foundations of the collection, 1807 to 1837, early cataloguing, 1838 to 1849, collecting, 1850 to 1877, expansion, and the British Museum Catalogue series. And you'll see these in a ribbon along the bottom of the screen as the talk progresses. The themes I mentioned earlier, however, cataloguing or registration, where coins came from, and challenges in researching coin collections will be woven throughout. In each section, I'll focus on some of the important figures at the British Museum, or who were involved in numismatics at this time, and you will notice, I'm sure, that they are all men. This was pretty much the norm at the time in Greek numismatic study and collecting, although prominent female figures such as Sarah Sophia Banks were collecting at the same time in other numismatic fields, such as modern coins and tokens. Much of this is to do with money and opportunity, and how records have been kept, as you will see. But as my research progresses, I'm hoping to look more thoroughly at the people involved to see who I might find. Before we move on to the presentation proper, I'd like to give a few notes on the terminology I'm going to use. So I'm going to refer to coins, perhaps unsurprisingly, the Department of Coins and Medals, and the coin collection throughout this talk. In fact, this is quite modern language. And in many of the archives and records that I work with, as was common in the 18th and 19th centuries, the term medals was generally used for coins as well as what we might recognise as medals today. The records also refer to the medal room as a generic name for the coins and medals section of the museum's collection before it became a separate department in 1861 and was officially called the Department of Coins and Medals. I'm going to talk about registration a lot today. Registration is the formal accession of an object to a museum by writing its details in a register and assigning a registration number. The registration number in different institutions can be in very different formats. In some museums, it is a running sequential number. In others, it incorporates pieces of information about the year of registration and the donor or vendor. In the whole British Museum collection, there are various examples of both kinds of number. In coins and medals, it is mainly the kind of number which incorporates further information. In various museums across the world, you'll find this kind of number referred to as a registration number, museum number, or accession number. This is all the same thing. Finally, the British Museum Greek coin collection is not primarily an archaeological collection, which you find in a number of museums. Although there are some hoards in the collection and a small amount of archaeological material, there are not large archaeological assemblages. In other parts of the collection, the Roman or the medieval coin collections in particular, there are much larger groups of hoards and archaeological material. The Greek coin collection is primarily made up of individual sales and donations of both large and small collections. In each case, work still needs to be done to establish whether there is an archaeological provenance or any identifiable find spot. This is work I've been conducting over the last couple of years, albeit with some limitations in the last year or so. The British Museum was founded by an Act of Parliament in 1753, based on the collections of Sir Hans Sloane, who you can see here. Hans Sloane was a physician and became president of the Royal Society and Royal College of Physicians, the only person so far to have held both positions simultaneously. Sloane had married Elizabeth Langley Rose in 1695, who was the widow of a plantation owner in Jamaica. And this marriage brought considerable wealth to Sloane based on the profits generated by enslaved labour. Sloane himself travelled to Jamaica as a physician and was assisted in collecting there by enslaved people, who at this period in Jamaica were mostly Akan from areas of modern Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. From Sloane's writings, we can also see that he knew slave traders, and these connections continued when he returned to London and continued to collect, often objects brought to the city through the slave trade. At this period, British wealth was closely entwined with the slave trade, even if individuals were not directly involved. Sloane often expanded his collections through the purchase of other people's collections, which again may have links back to wealth generated through the transatlantic trade or plantations in the New World. In his will, Sloane offered his collection to the British nation if a sum of £20,000 could be paid to his daughters. This is about £2.3 million today, or about 3.4 million Canadian dollars. This was a considerable underestimation of the real value of the collection, and the purchase was made through public lottery, making it a truly publicly owned collection. On the screen here, you can see some information about the Enlightenment Architectures website, which is a major academic project looking at the original catalogues of Sloane's collection across multiple institutions, mainly in London, and reconstructing the shape of Sloane's original collection. So if you're interested in Sloane himself and his collections, I really recommend going to this website to find out more. Here you can see the Act of Parliament of 1753 and some of its provisions stating the public aims for the British Museum. The museum actually only opened in 1759, as a location needed to be found. This was Montague House, which you saw on the first slide. A stately home, perhaps not entirely suited to being a museum, and there are later complaints about leaks in the building and so on. Although this was a public museum, we should be aware what public at this period meant. You needed to obtain a ticket in advance through written application, only available on certain days when most working people could not attend. You would also be conducted around the museum by an attendant in a tour, rather than being able to explore by yourself. Access to the public, as we might understand it more today, only really became more open towards the end of the 19th century. The founding coin collection consisted of Sloane's coins and coins from the Cotton collection, a 17th century collection of manuscripts and coins donated to the nation by Cotton's grandson. However, these are primarily English coins. It is frustrating that we don't have a definitive number of coins in Sloane's collection. There are two sources which give either 23,000 or 32,000 total coins. So we assume one is a mistake for the other, and we don't know which way round it is. There were originally 10 volumes cataloguing Sloane's coin collection, which was described in 1754 in the museum's minutes, but these volumes do not survive, which is most frustrating. It doesn't appear that much work was done on the coins in the 18th century. The two curators who are in charge of the collection, Andrew Gifford and then Richard Southgate, who you can see here, left no record of working on the coins, even though Southgate actually had his own coin collection, which he published, so he clearly had some numismatic ability. At this time, the museum contained the Library and Manuscripts collection, which is now the separate institution of the British Library, and a Natural History collection, which is now the Natural History Museum in South Kensington. We have almost no information about coins coming into the collection at this point, as they do not appear to have been registered or catalogued in a regular manner. The only coins I have definite information about at the moment belongs to major collections acquired by the museum. In the Greek series, the most significant came at the very end of the 18th century, when the Curator collection of books, manuscripts, prints, drawings, gems, shells, minerals, and coins were bequeathed to the museum. Although there are no records of where Clayton Mordaunt's Curator collected his coins, it's probable that he collected mostly in London. He was well known at the time for his lack of travel. He only ever left London to travel to Oxford. The vast majority of the 664 coins we have attributed to the Curator collection today at the British Museum are Roman Imperial, 610. About 40 or so are Greek and related material. By the end of the 18th century, there was an extensive coin trade in London, with numerous dealers in operation and frequent auctions. The published sales catalogues for these auctions are variable. Where they give provenance, it is to particular collectors rather than to find spots or archaeological provenance. And it is not uncommon that sales were anonymous, so previously the property of a distinguished gentleman, for example. The descriptions in the catalogues are very variable too. In some places, there are fully itemized lists of coins, which gives us some hope of finding exact matches in collections today. But quite often lot descriptions, such as a group of Greek coins, which really isn't of much use to researchers. I'd started the process surveying 18th century sales catalogues in February last year, and hope to continue this work to get a better picture of how much information we can put together from these records. This highlights one of the huge difficulties in examining historic coin collections, identifying exact specimens when your category of object is something which is mass produced. The level of additional detail needed to identify a coin exactly is much greater than for unique objects, a statue perhaps, or a vase, where poses or scenes described might identify an object. This is a fundamental issue which underlies most research into historic coin collections, and absent or poor cataloguing is a real hindrance to reconstructing original collections. Meanwhile, in the rest of Europe, in the late 18th century, numismatic research was modernizing rapidly. On the screen here, you can see the Austrian scholar, Joseph Hilarius Eckel, who is considered the founder of the modern discipline of numismatics. And in the study of Greek numismatics in particular, we owe him a huge debt. It's thanks to Eckel that I can visit most Greek coin collections in the world and be able to navigate my way around them with ease. Eckel recommended a geographical system for ordering coins in catalogues, starting in Spain and working round the Mediterranean clockwise with offshoots into neighbouring regions, and then returning to the Pillars of Hercules in Morocco. Britain only really caught up with Eckel's ideas with the arrival of Taylor Combe in the British Museum in 1807 as the new keeper of antiquities, which included the coin collection. His father, Charles Combe, had catalogued the Hunterian Museum's important coin collection in Glasgow, and had used an alphabetical format for this, which was much in line with other 18th century British work. In 1814, Taylor Combe wrote the very first catalogue of the British Museum's Greek coin collection. It's extraordinary to think that for the first 60 years or so of the British Museum, there was no formal catalogue of this collection. There are a few coins which have registration numbers for this period before 1814, but they have usually been part of other collections of wider object groups which received registration numbers elsewhere in the museum. Coins were not registered or catalogued in a systematic fashion until the Taylor-Coombe catalogue. However, this also had its shortcomings. Only coins from significant collections were marked with a provenance in the catalogue. It's not clear whether Coombe didn't know the origins of the unmarked coins, or whether the provenance was only thought significant if it was a major collection. I suspect the latter. In a collection of this kind, the information that appeared to be the most important was not where in the world the coin had been found, but its previous owner. This is something which remained of importance throughout the 19th century, and it's only really in the 20th and 21st centuries that researchers have looked to record or discover more accurate information. This information can be recovered in places in scholarly works published about various collections, which were then acquired by the British Museum. The information about find spots was not recorded as part of the acquisition, and so it is not in the historic information about the coins, but it can be reconstructed. One example of this is the de Bossé collection. Colonel Charles Philip de Bossé was a Swiss soldier and British imperial official. His collections are now in the British Museum and the Latanium in Neuchâtel, which was his birthplace in Switzerland. On behalf of the British government, he became governor of Kefalonia from 1810 to 1814, which is an island off the coast of the Western Peloponnese and part of modern Greece today. While in Kefalonia, de Bossé conducted excavations in the area, including in Ithaca, which formed the basis of his collections. Much of this archaeological material is in Switzerland today, but de Bossé offered his coin collection to the British Museum in 1815. Now, I'm still working through the records about this, but it appears that at some point between 1815 and 1818, de Bossé's collection was either sold or donated to the British Museum. Today, we have about 350 coins from this collection from across the Mediterranean, so it appears that de Bossé collected more widely than what was found in his archaeological explorations. However, de Bossé published an essay in 1815 describing 58 coins in his collection from Kefalonia, Ithaca, and Delphi, giving archaeological details for some of the coins. These details are not to modern archaeological standards by any means, but do give a fine spot location and is considerably better information than was recorded during the acquisition of the de Bossé coins in the British Museum. And I'm slowly restoring this information to the records now, and this will slowly start to roll out online through our online database. The largest acquisition at this time was the Richard Payne Knight collection in 1824. Payne Knight, in my opinion, really overlaps the themes of the 18th and early 19th centuries. After all, he mainly collected during the late 18th century, but his collection influenced cataloguing in the 19th century. A very impressive printed catalogue of Payne Knight's coins was produced, and this was the first time that this had happened. Payne Knight's position as a trustee of the British Museum and the size of the collection may have influenced this. No separate catalogue of the de Bossé collection, albeit on a somewhat smaller scale, had been made, nor for any other individual collection, not even Sloane. It's often noted in publications that there is a manuscript catalogue of Payne Knight's collection. There certainly was, and this is referred to in the preface of the printed version, but this no longer exists in the British Museum. I have searched for this, it is not there. I do remain hopeful that it might be found one day, but I'm afraid I assume it was disposed of when the printed catalogue was produced. The printed catalogue itself contains no provenance data. The scant information I've been able to find regarding the provenance of Payne Knight's collection is in a small notebook, and you can see a page of it here on the right. It's very short and clearly incomplete as the notebook progresses. But the first 2 pages have lists, like you can see here, of dates and sales where Payne Knight bought his coins, primarily in London, I think, from the names illustrated. The rest of the notebook is lists by geographical region with a list of mints with numbers of gold, silver and bronze coins from each mint. There is no further descriptive detail and no links from these geographical lists back to the sales to identify which coins were bought at which sale. Again, very frustrating. It's possible that more information is out there. Only recently, Alexia Petsalis Diomedes let me know that in the obituary of Thomas Burgon, there is a reference to Burgon selling coins to Payne Knight. This is information that does not appear in this notebook. Although the obituary does not state exactly which coins were sold, again, frustrating, it does at least give an idea of where to start looking. Edward Hawkins became Keeper of Antiquities in 1827. Like Taylor Combe, he too wrote a catalogue, this time a manuscript one in 1837, of the coins then in the collection, excluding any coins already catalogued by Taylor Combe, or which had a separate listing like Payne Knight. Although this manuscript contains more detail about provenance than Taylor Combe's did, it still only lists major collections down the right-hand side, as you can see here on the screen. This particular page lists Crasherode, Townley, and de Bossé, but leaves some entries blank. Again, I don't know whether this is because the provenance is unknown or whether the provenance was not thought significant. It is particularly interesting that Crasherode coins are listed since the collection arrived in 1799 and should all have been included in the Taylor Combe catalogue. So perhaps we can see Hawkins' work as correcting Taylor Combe by adding missed material where necessary. This brings me onto a subject very close to my heart, registration numbers. Every museum has its own system, and in the British Museum there are several in each department, of course, which has happened through the historic evolution of documentation. For coins, it's particularly important to understand what these mean because they may signify very different things. So on the screen here, I've listed some examples. At the top, we have the format for the Taylor Combe catalogue. Coins listed in this catalogue have a registration number in this format, where TC stands for the catalogue, P140 stands for the page number, and 1 stands for the coin listed as number 1 on page 140. In the Taylor Combe catalogue, the object number, 1 here, restarts for each mint or ruler. So it is entirely possible for there to be 2 number 1s on the same page. This has led to coins being given exactly the same catalogue number. So in recent years, particularly with the arrival of databases needing unique numbers, a suffix has been added, which does not exist in the original catalogue. So here you can see ITH has been added, and this is short for the mint of Ithaca. And this is something that you'll see on our online database, for example, but you won't see in the original catalogue. The same format is followed for the Richard Payne Knight collection and the Edward Hawkins catalogue, as I've put here a couple of examples. However, as time has gone on, this has led to misunderstandings. And I've seen in publications that both Taylor Combe and Edward Hawkins have been listed as the provenance for the coins as actually the original collectors. This is hardly surprising, given that the same format has been used for both administrative catalogues like these and for specific collection catalogues like Richard Payne Knight. And this is why I'm keen to make this history more widely known. I've added the Bank of England format here at the bottom to show that even as the 19th century progresses, these non-standard registration numbers do persist, although not to the same extent until quite recent times. So here is the standard registration numbering system, which was in use across the British Museum already at this period, but not fully adopted for coins until partway through the 19th century. Here, the long number consists of the year, a collection number, and the object number. The advantage of this system, unlike in Taylor Combe and Edward Hawkins, is that particular acquisitions are grouped together by the collection number, so you can see their coherence as a group in the acquisition. In Taylor Combe and Edward Hawkins, the coins are relisted under regions and mints, and therefore to see a whole group from de Bossé, for example, as I have done, you have to read the whole catalogue and make your own list. So if anyone wants the list of the de Bossé coins, ask me, I've already done the work. On the right here, you can see some examples of tickets which sit under the coins in the collection, which contain all of the information I've mentioned. On the left is an example of a standard number, and on the right, an example of a TC number to show you what these look like in practice. You'll note that on the left, there is a 53 rather than 1853, and this is common for the entire 19th century, as is the diamond-shaped pattern for the rest of the numbers. Other things you may see on a ticket are references to provenance. Here, Roland refers to the auction house Roland and Feudon, and the lot number for the coin from this particular auction is, you can see just below Roland. Above these examples are catalogue tickets for the British Museum catalogue series, which I'm going to come back to later in the presentation. Although we've now moved to the next section, I want to look back for a moment at 1825, when a general register of coin acquisitions was started. On the left, you can see a picture of some coins pulled out from a cabinet. We store most of our coins in the British Museum in quite a traditional fashion in mahogany cabinets. There are no numbers written on the coins themselves, as you might have on other objects. And the coins themselves sit on top of tickets, as you saw in the previous slide, with further information. The note on the right is the beginning of the 1825-1827 register and refers directly to the Richard Payne Knight bequest of 1824, so it's clear that this is what prompted it. However, as you can see here on the very first page of the register, it is significantly lacking in detail and is not really a register as we might understand it today. I appreciate that that's probably very hard to read, so I've put the text of the first entry on screen. You can see here that these are very general details, and this continues throughout the manuscript. Although in the case of Rich, whose collection is described here, there is actually a separate basic listing of some of his coins. But for most of the rest of the manuscript, it's only really useful for getting a general idea of what's arriving at the British Museum at this time. In 1835 to 38, there's another attempt at making a register format. And this is a little bit more successful. However, as you can see from the two collections I've put here, on the left there are no numbers, and on the right there are. So even though the Graves collection immediately follows the Millingen collection in this register. In 1838, although the medal room was still part of the Department of Antiquities, a separate series of minutes was kept with information relating to coins and medals. Edward Hawkins was still the keeper, and he appears frequently in the minutes, requesting permission from the trustees for purchases, which start to give a bit more information. Principally, Hawkins is spending money at auctions, sometimes for named collections and sometimes in general sales. There are also records of individuals approaching the museum, offering their collections for sale. It does need to be carefully checked, however, as specific collections didn't always come to the museum. The minutes only note the approval of sums of money for these collections, and not the confirmation that this sum was actually spent and the coins acquired. So it does need to be double checked against other records. There's an exchange in the minutes book for 1841 to 2 between Edward Hawkins and the trustees over duplicates. It appears that it was the practice at the time to purchase or receive donations of large collections or groups of coins, and then the curators would decide which coins should be kept and which ones sold. This was principally based on what was already in the collection, whether there was already an example of a certain coin or a design, for example. This is the most straightforward type of removal of duplicates, and I'm going to return to this subject with a slightly more complex case later on. But the main problem in the 1840s was there was no proper listing of coins coming into the museum. When we think of registration, this is usually the process of writing down the details of an object in an official register, and most importantly, assigning a number to the object. That process had not been followed for coins regularly up to this period. With larger numbers of coins coming into the collection, this was now causing problems. Keepers of departments like Hawkins needed to get permission from the trustees to sell duplicates, and they quite rightly pointed out that they needed to see a list of coins and where they had come from. Unfortunately, Hawkins was not able to provide a full list because curators had regularly been removing duplicates to a separate cabinet without keeping a record of where they'd come from, and it's now not possible to reconstruct their origins. From the 1840s onwards, therefore, there appears to have been some experiments in keeping itemised registers on a regular basis for both acquisitions and the coins actually registered. This dual system was labour intensive and did not last long, but it did start the process of regular registration with more and more relevant detail, which makes coins easier to match to their records. So, for example, weights, full descriptions, details of inscriptions on the coins, for example. The importance of good record keeping was underlined at the end of the 1840s. In April 1849, a serious theft took place at the British Museum. In the study room, the attendants had noted that tickets were being dropped under a visitor's chair and discovered that coins had been removed from the collection. The police were called and directed to the lodgings of the visitor, a man called Timoleon Vlasto. On entering his lodgings, the police found a large collection of coins, arrested Vlasto, and opened an investigation. As well as the British Museum, other collections reported visits from Vlasto and the belief that they too were missing coins. This included the Bank of England collection and the private collection of General Fox. The trial of Timoleon Vlasto has many points of interest, but for the purposes, it's a fascinating case, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to focus on one. As I've already mentioned, identifying a unique coin up to this period could sometimes be tricky, depending on the quality of the records kept. Even then, if there was no accurate drawing, then it would be hard to prove ownership of particular coins. This was part of Vlasto's defence. He stated that the coins discovered at his lodgings were in fact his own collection. And to find out what happened next, I'd like to read you a section of a newspaper report in Lloyd's weekly newspaper on Sunday, the 22nd of April, 1849. Mr. Doubleday, one of the curators of the antiquities, swore positively to two coins, now produced, as having been stolen from the collection in the museum under his care. He could not be mistaken about them, for he had taken previously to the theft a cast from each of them in a sulphur mould, which was the most perfect kind that could be made, and gave the minutest flaw and peculiarity of the original with great exactness. He could therefore swear, without any doubt, to the identity of those two coins. He had taken no cast since the robbery. The coins had been in the possession of the police since the arrest of the prisoner, and they were found by Inspector Field of the A Division of Police, concealed in a secret drawer in the prisoner's writing desk. The inspector, in the course of his evidence, now produced in addition 71 valuable coins, which he also found at the prisoner's lodgings, 15 St. James Square. General Fox identified the greater part of these as having been stolen from his cabinet, to which the prisoner had access. Of the remainder, he could not be so positive, although they were all rare and valuable, and similar at least to those which were missing from his collection. With the other, certainly more identified ones, he could have no doubt they were the same. So, as far as I can work out, I think this is the first time that casts of coins were used as evidence in court. They proved beyond reasonable doubt that these two coins at least belonged to the British Museum collection, and along with testimony from the other collections which had missing items, by extension, that the coins in Vlasto's possession were all stolen. Vlasto was sentenced to transportation to Australia. I've managed to trace him as far as Tasmania, whereafter he disappeared, possibly absconding. Wherever he ended up, I actually hope he had a happy life. Transportation to labour in a penal colony was a very cruel system, not just for those transported, but also for the original inhabitants of places like Tasmania, whose lands were taken to establish these penal colonies. Looking at Vlasto's case with modern eyes, I also cannot be sure that all the coins in his possession were stolen. It was certainly assumed that since he had demonstrably stolen some, he must have stolen all. But given the difficulties in exact identification, I don't think we can be sure of this. This coin you can see on the screen is one of a handful I've managed to identify from the Vlasto case. This one was in fact a coin from General Fox's collection. After the court case, there was a large number of coins seized from Vlasto, which could not immediately be matched to particular collections. They were held for a time by the Treasury and then stored separately at the British Museum in case someone came forward with a claim and could prove that these coins were part of their own collection. In 1851, General Fox wrote to the museum, having identified from his records that he was missing this coin of Maronea. As you can see, the museum arranged to buy the coin rather than return it. Most of the Fox collection is now in the Münzkabinett of the Bode Museum in Berlin. And there are still a few notes, which my colleagues kindly checked for me, attached to tickets there, stating that particular coins were recovered from Vlasto during this case. I've yet to find an official record that remaining coins from the case could be absorbed into the British Museum collection, but I assume this must have happened at some point, since I have found a few coins which have a special V ticket and a modern supplementary number indicating that they did not have an original official registration number. These V tickets were referred to in Fox's communications with the museum, withdrawing, so I can be certain they were associated with the case. This is perhaps an extreme example of the importance of good cataloguing. And in the next period of time I'm covering, we can see there's an increased emphasis on the regularization of registration and also printed catalogues with images. The last period of time I'm covering today saw huge changes in the organisation of the museum. The new Robert Smirke design building, which is what you can see today mostly, was in the final stages of construction, and in 1861 the Department of Antiquities separated into three new departments: Oriental Antiquities, Greek and Roman Antiquities, and Coins and Medals. It's the 160th anniversary of my departments this year. This coincided with the retirement of Edward Hawkins, and the new keeper of Coins and Medals was William Vaux. By 1869, the devolution of the departments had reached individual series. As you can see here on the left, a series of separate Greek registers started in 1869, and a separate register was maintained for other sections of the department's collections, such as Roman coins, medieval coins, and so on. This allowed for much more detail to be recorded in the registers about individuals, as well as details of the coins themselves, as opposed to major collectors only. Although I have to say that some of these individuals are easier to track down than others. There are a lot of things like Mr. Smith, Captain Jones. This makes it quite hard to know who these people are. Separate registers can actually lead to further problems, as there were duplications of registration numbers across the series. With modern databases and the need for unique numbers, this has led to some problems, most of which we've solved by adding a series prefix to the number. So in my case, this is G for Greek. The experiences of earlier years led to a sustained effort from the trustees to begin a new printed catalogue series. Better record keeping was certainly part of this drive, but a greater public interest in coins had been gathering pace for some time. The Numismatic Society of London was founded in 1836, for example, and is now the Royal Numismatic Society and the British Numismatic Society. It's split. There were a number of revisions of study facility access in this period too. Some of this is connected to the use of the new buildings, but it also reflects the growing interest of the public in accessing the collection to further their own knowledge, whether for private collecting or for academic pursuits. Greek coins were not the only section of the collection targeted at this period for a catalogue, and we also shouldn't forget that the very earliest British Museum catalogue was of the Anglo-Gallic series in 1826. The 1850s and 60s, however, provided the main impetus for a wider range of catalogues, and the largest series of these was for Greek coins. Now, these published catalogues were very different from the catalogues produced by Taylor Coombe and Edward Hawkins. They were meant for wide distribution and scholarly use, and each catalogue, as well as listing coins by mint and ruler chronologically, had introductions which covered a wide range of contextualizing details for particular regions or mints, talking about design, chronology, attribution. These catalogues were meant for public use rather than a catalogue for administrative reasons. You can see here on the right the preface to the first volume setting out the details the reader could expect. Although the first two BMCs, Italy and Sicily, did not have plates but drawings, the rest of the series did. The first catalogue, Italy, was published in 1873, and the series ran until 1927 with Cyrenaica. These catalogues are still in use today, despite being outdated in places, for example, where attributions have changed. They're still a tool used to refer to and identify British Museum coins today, as I can confirm, as I often receive inquiries using these numbers from these catalogues. Now, the final example I'm going to give you today is one of the most important later 19th century coin acquisitions in the British Museum, but it's also a cautionary tale in approaching research into historic acquisitions and archives, particularly with coins. The Bank of England started assembling a coin collection in the early 19th century to act as a reference. However, there were a number of problems with access, and this was not really built up or maintained in a coherent fashion. Very quickly, it lost its original purpose and was not really used as it had been intended. Most of the collection was built up in the first half of the 19th century and consisted of British coins, modern coins, mostly gifts from members of staff returning from travels, and from other state institutions or mints, and ancient Greek coins. The Greek coins were mostly bought from Henry Perigal Borel, who was based in Smyrna, modern Izmir, who was aware of what the bank had and offered groups of coins to fill gaps in the collection. This, in fact, was very similar to the practice Borel had undertaken with the British Museum, and the coins appear to have been mainly acquired during his time in Smyrna. In 1865, the Bank of England placed their collection on loan to the museum to be made available through the British Museum study facilities. And in 1877, this loan was made a donation, and the Bank of England gave permission for any duplicates to be sold and the proceeds to be used for further purchases. Now, as we've seen, removing duplicates before formal registration was standard practice. However, the gift was so large and the proceeds from the sales so great that this situation was treated differently. The Bank of England duplicates, along with duplicates from the British Museum collection, which had been replaced by better examples from the Bank of England collection, was sold in a series of sales from 1878. By my rough calculations, the proceeds of the sales at Sotheby's alone came to around £1,500 or £100,000 in today's money, which is about 170,000 Canadian dollars. There were other private sales of lots to dealers as well at this time, and I haven't finished calculating the full amount that was generated. But the note here on these duplicates, along with Bank of England coins not required, the museum took the opportunity to remove coins from the existing collection for sale if they could be replaced by a better example from the Bank of England. By any stretch of the imagination by this point in the 19th century, these would have been fully registered museum objects. The trustees had to give permission for these sales, but it's an interesting window into the treatment of mass-produced objects and under what terms they could be disposed of. It's something deserving of more research at a later date, I'd say. A special fund was set up to administer these funds to purchase further coins for the collection. And this is where the problem started. In the Greek coin section, 1,024 coins were registered from the Bank of England. However, the same register, which you can see on the right here, was then used to carry on sequentially from number 1,025 for the new acquisitions, with little records exactly of where the coins came from. So there is a note which you may not be able to read right across the centre of these pages, which states supplementary, i.e. purchased with the funds arising from the sale of duplicate coins of the bank collection. New coins were even given the special BNK Bank of England tickets, which had been produced for the donation, although they had never been in the Bank of England collection. This causes a number of problems. I can only assume at the time the donation was so significant and the purchase fund so important that everyone knew this arrangement. This blurring of the financing of new acquisitions and the provenance of the original coins doesn't seem to have been a particular issue at the time. And if we step back and look at the Greek section, it's hugely important to know that these coins were sold by Borel and connected to those coins sold directly to the British Museum. And at present, this is not reflected in our database, for example. So here's another good example. All of these electrum statas from Cyzicus, which you can see on the left here, are currently listed on our database as from the Bank of England collection. However, they're all beyond the number 1024 in the register. We have a receipt book, which contains receipts for some of the purchases. And so we know that some of these coins at least were purchased from Alfred Lawson, who was an employee of the Imperial Ottoman Bank. Although we don't know exactly which ones, because 7 are listed on the receipt and there's more than 7 here. We often comment on the strength of institutional memory, but there are some limits to what is remembered as time passes, even when something's written in a register. So I checked with some of my colleagues and they weren't aware that there was this issue with Bank of England coins. So now starts the long work of correcting the information on the database. This is important work to carry out. Just in the case of Alfred Lawson, there are other coins and small artifacts we've bought directly from him in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So if anyone wanted to research him, they wouldn't actually get the full picture at the moment from our database. So what can I conclude from all of this? I've given you a very brief whistle-stop tour of quite complex material, and there is still a lot of further research to be done. So for now, I'll conclude by saying why I think this kind of work is important in numismatic collections. Firstly, numismatics is a specialist subject, but this doesn't mean that research should be conducted out of context. All of the collectors I've mentioned today had wider collecting interests. And I've highlighted coins here, but they're often glossed over in detailed reports or articles about collections as they're seen as too complex. I think it's important for numismatists to work on collection histories to provide this information to wider scholarship. Secondly, the British Museum is huge and a complicated institution with a long history. Any attempt to write a history of the museum as a whole has to be quite general, and the nuances of particular parts of the collection are left out. Since academics and students want to use collections data in their work, it's important to get these nuances out there in an accessible format. So, for example, I've plans to write a reference guide to our registration systems in the department. Thirdly, and finally, it's incredibly easy to make mistakes when a lot of time has passed since an event, as we've seen with the Bank of England. I now know what's happened there, and there's quite a lot of work to do to fix the information on the database. I feel it's very important that as curators, we record this kind of information as we come across it, so we're not leaving problems for future curators. So finally, thank you all so much for your attention. And I'd like to thank Marina and Nickel Galleries again for their very kind invitation.
Thank you, Amelia, so much. This is absolutely fascinating, and I would love to open the floor for questions. Let me actually see if I will open the chat and see if anybody.
It is open.
Oh, perfect. So you can either type your question in a chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question, whatever the preference is.
Marina, can I go ahead?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, Katie.
Hi,
Katie.
How are you? Amelia, thank you so much for this talk. It was extremely fascinating. And there's so many aspects that I appreciate in terms of curatorial practice, learning the history of collecting and the nature and the discipline of numismatics as a whole. And I'm sure the mysteries you have to solve become frustrating at times. I was just curious about whether or not there was any correlation between interest in the coins, both what the museum already had and then in further acquisition, and the growth of other parts of the collection. And I'm thinking particularly of the arrival of the Parthenon reliefs, and whether that drove anything, or if, because the coins were kind of specialist, that they just kind of stayed on their own.
So obviously I focused on coins today because that's my thing. But what quite often happens in the museum was very large multiple object type collections came into the museum. Ooh, you've moved. There you are. Zoom.
Yeah.
So there were coins associated with the Elgin collection, for example, and with the Townley collection. They weren't a significant part of those collections. And that was when the coins part of the museum were part of the antiquities department, which of course covered the other parts of the Elgin and Townley collections. So those coins are now in the Department of Coins and Medals. We have all sorts of charts of how the department split up over the years, which I won't bore you with. So what I would say from what I've looked at so far, there were definitely specialist coin collectors, but particularly in the 18th and early 19th centuries, they weren't the norm. What was normal was for someone like Sloane or Crasherode or Elgin or Townley to have much wider collections. And it was sort of, I think it was sort of seen as a gentlemanly thing to do, to have at least a few coins as part of these collections, to show your breadth of knowledge and your erudition. So certainly in the case of Sloane and Payne Knight, even though they travelled, they collected from other collectors. They collected from dealers in London. With Elgin and Townley, they probably collected coins while travelling. It's interesting for Payne Knight, he did go on the Grand Tour, I think more than once, but didn't actually collect any coins during that, as far as we know. It was all collected in a very short period in London and perhaps in Paris. And from dealers, not actually from locations, in the Mediterranean area. So something like Elgin Townley, it seems to be material associated with other collecting at this period. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I was just curious kind of like how things came together.
It is really interesting sort of how this kind of material was seen at this time, and I think that's quite typical.
Well, thank you, and thank you for demystifying the catalogs and the acquisition numbers, because I actually really appreciate that.
There's so much more to do. There's a whole article in there on the registration numbers.
Yeah, so
excellent.
Keep on.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the next question. Scott?
Hi, thank you. That was a fantastic talk, and it's great to hear the history of how the British Museum developed and how the coins came into the collections. I remember when I first got to the museum a couple years ago, I was just kind of blown away with how all this worked, and I was able to talk to someone within your I can't remember the gentleman's name now, but in terms of helping us identify some coins from the archaeology site I worked at. But I was curious about, in terms of current policies of acquisition of coins, and how the museum kind of delegates this in terms of provenance of these coins and where they're coming from in terms of illicit trades, and how does the museum tackle this kind of a situation? Because in terms of my own experience with coins, which is very limited at the moment, but hopefully expanding. Some of the research I've done is that when it comes to material culture, we're very strict about the illicit trade of items and, marble busts and jewelry and so on and so forth. But yet coins are just kind of like this thing that are just out there. And I'm curious about how the museum deals with this.
It's an interesting question, Scott. There's a lot of tension currently in various institutions and in different countries over what do you do about coins which have clearly been in the trade and in circulation for many years, but don't actually have an original fine spot provenance, for example. So from my particular perspective, in the BM, I don't really add to the collection. So there has the largest addition to the collection during my time was part of the John Morecambe collection, principally of coins of Sicily and southern Italy, in 2013. And I spent a long time with John going through his records for the coins there, and they all principally came from collections which went back to the 1910s and 1920s. We had the provenance back through dealers' records and original tickets for those collections. Now that isn't always possible, and so because that isn't always possible, as a general principle, I don't really look to acquire coins for my part of the collection because there are so many difficulties, ethical difficulties in collecting in my part of the collection. If you think of the sort of geographical territory I cover, I would say in the department the vast majority of acquisitions in recent years have been British. So there's been a lot of Roman hoards found in Britain, for example. So that's a good example. British material, the modern part of the collection, and the medals collection are the most rapidly growing section of the collection. There isn't an official moratorium on collecting in my part of the department, but personally, I don't see the need to acquire more. We already have quite a large collection. It's quite comprehensive. So for teaching purposes, for exhibitions, for display, what we have is what we need. And I don't really see the need to collect on a large scale.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's thank you very much. It was just interesting, specifically because I study mostly Byzantine, and being that the empire is geographically so vast, it's an interesting question that I was curious about how we tackle these kinds of issues, right? And we seem to do it.
Yeah, it's an ongoing debate and conversation. And I think we're all much more aware of these issues today than even maybe 10, 20 years ago.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And it was a great presentation.
Thanks, Scott. I've seen a couple of questions in the chat, Marina. Would it be all right to answer them in order?
Yes, go for it. I was just about to read it. Go for
it. Okay. Should I read them in case people can't read the chat? Michelle has asked, can you say if your research is part of the broader BM initiative? In a manner of speaking, yes. I am one of the leaders of a research group, which it's not a funded project as such. There are collections of curators and other colleagues in the museum who belong to research groups within the museum. And we focus on the history of the British Museum collection. So we're all a sort of group of interested individuals with knowledge about our own parts of the collection. And it's been wonderful to sort of bounce ideas off them and say, is it the same in your departments in the 1820s that this has happened? So it's fantastic to have their support. Most of what I have done is essentially through my own initiative rather than being part of a funded or organised research project. I have departmental responsibility for the archives in my department. So each of us in the department have responsibilities given out to us, and archives is one of mine. So I'm meant to have answers. So I've made it my business to find out more about our archives so I can answer these questions. And then in the chats, Paul has asked, Are the contents of the old registers, catalogues and list available in electronic form? If they were, then this information could be mined. Oh, Paul, you're a man after my own heart. I would absolutely love that to be the case. I am personally transcribing our minutes from 1838 onwards, which is taking a while, but it has been a wonderful lockdown activity, shall we say. And I also hope that at some point we could get a project going on crowdsourcing transcriptions for some of our archives as well, because we have an absolutely huge archive and it's quite complicated and it's not very clear always how all the different parts connect to each other. So my big ambition is, yes, to be able to make database queries, matching algorithms. It would just be wonderful, Paul, and hopefully at some point in the future.
And last question, Joshua, thank you.
Well, first off, I just want to say thank you for such an absolutely fascinating talk. But I was curious, given, as you mentioned, most of the early acquisitions were coming from either antiquarians or personal collectors, and then now we've transitioned a bit more to finds within the UK context. I was wondering if earlier on in the early 1800s, there were any acquisitions that came either directly from Horde finds or any kind of acquisitions that came from either field work from antiquarians or anything that sourced was that rather than coins that had been brought from a context at a much earlier date?
Yes, but not really in the Greek collection. We do have Hordes, not as many as other collections do. In fact, we do have some Hordes material, but that tends to be more 20th century, early 20th century, and some very late 19th century. For the early 19th century period, we do have Roman Hordes, for example, which are recorded. In fact, I was just rereading the minutes books, and one of the first entries in 1838 concerns a horde, some of which was melted down rather than collected. So, but that was Roman rather than Greek. So really, on that side of things, it tends to be Roman, medieval, early medieval material in particular, which tends to be collected at those dates for that sort of material.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Well, it's time to wrap up. I want to thank you, Amelia, so much. This was very inspiring. And now I'm already thinking about what we're going to do here. It was great privilege to have you talk here at Nickel at Noon, and we also hope to see you all again next Thursday. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful week.